Start sharing my screen here. Hopefully we get a couple more join us here. This is our last scheduled meeting with the technical committee. Sorry, I've been trying a new lamp at my home desk and it's not quite organizing right here, but I'll have to work on that later. So looks like we have Hope, Annika, Amelia, Carla, and Nick on. Let's see who else here we had going. Yeah, I'm not sure if Tyler was going to join us. He typically does. Okay. Well, I think we'll just go ahead and get started then, and if others hop on, we can bring them up to speed. Like I mentioned, this was our last scheduled steering committee meeting, or technical committee meeting, I guess is what we've been calling this. And so this week we'll be kind of finishing up the full draft, but really today we wanted to go over, if you remember last time we talked a lot about the housing demand numbers and those population and demand forecasts. And so we want to take the time today to go over kind of the headlines for our strategic program recommendations and directions. The plan itself will describe them in a lot more detail, but we want to talk about them today and hopefully answer any questions or things off the top of your head that come up before jumping into the document for review. If you recall our schedule, we kind of are pushing through. November was our deadline to have a full draft, and we're on schedule to have that to you all this week. We've got really well, I can just show you here. Let's see. Well, maybe I'll pull it up at the end. My computer's being a little slow on that side. So today, policies and programs, we're going to be talking about, sorry, my presentation mode here is messing up my dual screen. You think I would have figured this out by now with all the Zoom meetings. I want to get my annotation up here. Here we go. Policies and strategies today we're going to be discussing. In November and December will be mostly review time, on schedule for January to present a larger community presentation on what we've been talking with all of you about over these past several months. So next, just really wanted to quickly go through kind of the high level goals. I think we talked about these last time a little bit, but just kind of to go back and reorient ourselves before we jump into the strategies and recommendations we'll be going to. One thing, and you'll see this noted in the draft, is really the housing condition in Story County and around Story County is really fairly good. So a lot of our strategies are going to be focused on new development, lot development, but also some things just to make sure that we keep our existing programs in place to preserve the existing housing stock. So we'll be providing some strategies to make sure we continue to do that as our homes continue to age. Obviously, structural issues and deficiencies become more prevalent. So we want to make sure that those, especially the elderly and lower income, have the resources to maintain those housing stock. Grow the number of rental units for all age groups. This was something we've talked about almost every meeting. So we have some strategies focusing on what that, how to do that in a strategic way. Obviously, it can be a variety of housing types. Doesn't necessarily have to be what most think of as apartments, your multi-story apartment units. These can be actually also small footprint homes, townhomes, and other similar smaller scale development that could be developed specifically for rental units. I think one of the big focus of our recommendations is affordable lots. So lot development in the county outside of Ames, well, in Ames too, actually, is a challenge for a number of reasons that we've been talking with all of you about over the past several months. So we'll be going over some strategies on how to stimulate direct lot development for certain price points and indirectly through other investment programs like TIF and abatement strategies, and how to use those to the best ability for public dollars to make sure we're getting the return on investment for those. Foster grassroots efforts. This is really focused on local involvement, either in the development process itself or through lending and employer partnerships, such as either direct financing assistance or advertising and marketing sort of things. So that's something we'll talk about in a little more detail as well. Obviously, and we've talked about this every time, maintaining fair zoning and regulations. So checking that our zoning codes actually allow the strategies that we're going to be recommending, and we'll in the document have a high-level overview of each of the larger community zoning codes to just kind of check to make sure the strategies we're recommending are possible under existing zoning regulations. If they're not, then suggestions for updates to those. So those were the high level goals for Story County, really building off everything we've been talking about over the last several months. So now we just want to go into our outline that you'll see in the document for our strategic program directions. If you recall, at our last meeting, we talked about our forecasted housing demand for the next 10 years. Just a reminder here what that is. All of Story County excluding Ames. We had that projection about 1,300 units, which is about 300 units above what you constructed in the last 10 years. And you see the breakdown by the larger communities here. That's something we, like I said, talked about last time and detailed more in the document. So with all of that in mind, we've got a series of goals here that we just talked about listed on the right-hand side that we'll be relating the strategies to. But first, there's really one overarching strategy that applies to all of the goals here. It's something we've been talking about more and more, not just with Story County, but really almost all the communities and counties we work with, because it's such a critical issue right now. And one of the main reasons that either the certain types of housing products you want aren't getting built, or those certain types of housing products you need maybe are not getting supplied either. And that really comes down to sharing risks with everyone involved in the process. The private market, obviously, there's a big risk for them to do a lot of different things in the housing market. If that's from a product type that they're not usually building or used to building, or whether it's deviating from different models because of rising material costs or whatever that may be. So here are a series of tools that we're going to be talking about for ways to share that risk. One thing that is important that we'll talk about as well is we really don't want to, we want to share the risk for the products that we want in Story County to fill our needs. So large lot development, is something that's getting built pretty regularly in Story County, and really not something maybe we should be targeting our strategies at for incentives or subsidies or whatever that may be. So these would be, we say large lot, that's kind of relative to the context of the community, but generally that's lots above 10 to 12,000 square feet. Those are, we want to target lots under that are more affordable and reduce the overall cost of housing. And those are typically things not getting built on a wide scale either. So just one by one, we'll go through each of these as possibilities for sharing risk, as well as some case studies throughout the document as well, will be provided. We'll provide a few in here just to give a tasting of what kind of case studies those may be. So number one, tools, public-private partnerships. This is something else already being done to some extent today. One being the Story County Housing Trust Fund that's set up, making sure obviously that's still meeting your needs, reviewing the directives and adjustments as you go along. But some other new ideas that aren't in Story County today, or at least not that we know of, are things like lending consortiums. That would be basically a lending pool where funds are pooled together. An organization takes charge of that, typically a nonprofit, or it could be a for-profit or a banking community or something like that. An example here we provided was from Grand Rapids, Michigan, and this will be explained more in the document, but they actually devote a housing fund for affordable housing and sets a it helps achieve their kind of citywide policy to have 30% of their new units be affordable housing units. And so they fund that lending consortium. Oh, in this case, the way they lend is kind of varies, but they fund it by actually city or county appropriations from tax revenues. There's obviously private and philanthropic contributions, other grant funds that get thrown into that. And they also devote a certain portion of excess revenues from the general operating fund into that. So that's a pretty aggressive policy that the city itself has kind of made its priority initiative to devote funds into that. So that's obviously they've identified that as something high on their list and devoted funds accordingly. There's other ways to do it as well and put money into that. And there's a variety of ways that we'll provide in the document. Some other private-public partnerships, obviously major employers. I think we've mentioned this throughout our meetings. There's ways for employers to get involved, especially if they're seeing the need from their employees that want to live in Story County and work in for recruitment. We've seen communities and in fact, a lot of our housing studies are actually initiated by employers that reach out to cities and say, hey, we need help with this. And so we've seen them provide rent guarantees for developers if they build a certain housing product. The employer is saying, hey, we'll guarantee your rent. And if no one occupies the unit when it's first built for the first 3 to 5 years or whatever, typically I should say actually almost all the time, they never have to cash in on that. The guarantee, however, reduces the risk for the developer because they know they'll get the rent for the first 3 months, whether it comes from the employer subsidizing that or folks filling up the units, which it's almost always folks filling up the units. So, and then obviously realtors, builders, and developers. There's partnerships already happening in this realm. Builders and developers talking with the city, working on code adjustments, working on lot development or infrastructure cost sharing, and different things like that. So these are things that are kind of already being done as well, but we have some strategies from other communities that we'll provide in the document as well. Another item for sharing risk is nonprofit developer. This is something we see in some communities to success. In fact, we see it as a major driver because it takes the risk out of somebody trying to make profit on development. So this is really filling that gap where the private market can't be successful. One example here is from Michigan, which actually this is the county that Grand Rapids is in as well. It's funded by community foundations, and they work with the city. They're kind of the middle organization, so they'll work with the city on evaluating standards for development and reducing those barriers, but at the same time, they're working with the developer to find available land, assemble plats, some of those soft costs for development. So they really take some of the gap out of that and risk out of both sides of the equation, and bring the two to the table to work together. So that's kind of again, an aggressive example of that we've seen in some communities, but there's even smaller steps that a nonprofit developer can take in sharing risk with the private market. One thing you're probably all very familiar with is infrastructure cost sharing. This is kind of an easy way to share the risk. Like I said, some cities are doing this already to some extent. Things like infrastructure cost sharing, which I mentioned before, for upsizing or even just putting in the infrastructure ahead of time. There are other things that can be done, like special assessment or subordinate payments, and even focusing that cost sharing on the products that you want. So only providing that cost sharing when it's meeting the character or design that the housing products that you need in your communities. So that's just kind of a policy target for that as well. And I should say, feel free to chime in and ask questions or comments as we're going through. I know this is kind of a lot of a lot of data getting thrown right now. One thing that we see in Story County as kind of a major hurdle is the land assembly piece. Like I said, there's not many lots across the county right now that are available, shovel ready for new housing. Huxley has some available still, and there's some in some other communities as well. But this is something that is a way to share risks, and we see as a kind of an essential strategy. Multiple ways to do this as well, but this could be working with a nonprofit developer that we just talked about, working with local landowners who aren't maybe wanting to sell at this point, and identifying their goals for the future. There's obviously potential for public lands and sites that cities already own, and reusing that land in different ways for infill development. We've actually seen sometimes in Emporia, I think it was Emporia, Kansas, they have a lot of park space, and maybe more than they need. So they were going through and actually carving out small areas of park space for housing infill. Not, like I said, not extensively to the point where they're taking away a ton of park space, but they just had a little too much. And so the city was actually converting some of that to infill housing. So that's just kind of low hanging fruit for land that's already in public possession. So just again, keeping in mind all those strategies for sharing the risk, those kind of play into all of the goals. So they don't necessarily fit under one, but it's kind of this umbrella strategy that we need to be considering and incorporating with all our goals, strategy goals. So then jumping into the specifics for each goal, starting with creating supply of affordable lots. We talked about this a little bit with the sharing the risk, but again, it's targeting the risk for affordable lots for those that are meeting needs. So we put less than 10,000 square foot lots here. And so we talked about these before. These are really targeted to making sure that the smaller lots are able to be built by the developers in a profitable way. Land assembly is one of those ideas. Direct lot development could be undertaken by the nonprofit developer. And really considering that, this is a long-term investment and budgeting annually for something like that. So for example, giving away a lot for $1 is not a bad thing if it's going to produce a housing unit, and understanding that those returns are going to come through years of property tax revenue and not necessarily from the sale of the lot itself, which is something we've seen some communities hold on to lots because they're trying to get a price out of it, and it's really that shouldn't be the goal. the goal should be to get a house on that lot. As far as growing the number of rental units for all age groups, there's several examples for this. This is something that is a little bit maybe a more difficult goal to achieve in this climate, because developers and builders they have their products that are making them just fine profits right now, and changing that to a different product type really takes a lot of upfront costs to not only design the housing product, but go through processes, especially if there's not land to build those on. I should say not land that's zoned appropriately to build those types of units on. So going through different approval processes can take time as well and add to the cost. So a few items here that we're recommending for strategies to do that. One is leveraging risk sharing tools that we talked about before with different products. So this is really goes back to targeting your policies to and incentives to the product type you want. So if it's rental units, only really upping the leverage in those risk sharing tools for those products and financing mechanisms. Obviously, building reuse, downtown commercial. I know not every city or community has these opportunities for building reuse, but we know with the changing landscape in retail and really just upper story downtown uses or other commercial uses are opportunities for infill, even if it's only a few units. That is still a help to some of these communities. That really a few units will go a long way to provide some assistance for folks looking to live in their communities. One thing that could help with the upfront costs of for developers to maybe pursue these types of projects are prepackaged site plans and RFPs. So we'll provide some examples in the document, but one is a city, actually Chattanooga, Tennessee. They actually provide a series of site plans and development concepts for things like 2 to 4 unit townhomes, even up to 8 plexes and such, and different layouts where they've drawn it out and in the lot, in certain lots arrangements and zoning arrangements, and basically say if you do this design, it will get approved. There's really no significant approval process. They basically lay it out and here's the design we want. If you do it, it'll get fast tracked and approved. So that really reduces some of the risk of the upfront costs for the developer. They don't have to budget in for a series of approval meetings. They don't have to worry so much about the design time it would take to do that. And we've seen this also with ADUs as well, where some cities are going in and designing accessory dwelling unit layouts and basically, here's the designs that we'll accept, and it really fast tracks that process. In other cities, I think we have an example from Fairfield, Iowa, where they actually put out an RFP for a development site they had available, and developed a prototypical, this is what we kind of want to see from a layout perspective. And so really this is all about setting the expectations right up front, so the developers and builders know what to expect. They know what the goals and objectives are of the city, and it takes a lot of that risk and uncertainty out of that process, and really just puts them a step ahead of risk and soft costs up front.
Yeah, Charlotte, sorry, jump in here.
Yep.
This baby. It's interesting because two things on here interesting, because this morning I just had a conversation with a developer about a project they're trying to do and kind of some of the pushback they're getting, and they're just like, it's not, the time might not be worth it, and I think we're probably just going to kind of walk away from it, where when they have this kind of, they know what the ground, I think that's the biggest thing we're hearing right now is they want to know what ground rules are And if they play to those ground rules, is it going to be a smooth process? Because that saves them a lot of money. And so that's the biggest thing. And I think that's kind of what you can kind of get with the prepackaged things too. I don't think that means they can't have some design variability in them, but knowing that they don't have to go through a painful process can make a huge difference in that, in getting more production done. I was also, just as a little side note, that this weekend I saw an article about the number of conversions, both industrial buildings and office buildings getting converted to housing options. So take a look around, and what building did you never think could be housing? Now, I'm not going to say, please don't start converting all of our old Morton buildings into housing, but it's definitely a growing area. It was amazing, this bar chart that I saw on the number of units that have been converted in the last kind of 20 years compared to the previous 20 years. Anyway.
Yeah, and the reuse one, I mean, we've traditionally been seeing this focused in the last 10 years on old school buildings that discontinued school use in communities, mostly rural areas. They convert them to rental units. That we are seeing that might start to transition. Well, still old school buildings being reused, but it's going to expand to other buildings as well, especially as the uncertainty of dropping continue online retail sales, but also the sort of uncertain effects of COVID and how that may transition to workplaces and at-home working in the long term. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
I wanted to throw in 2 cents on it. I've wondered, like in looking in Roland, with a dead downtown on Main Street, and our ruling is you can't have residential on the ground floor. And what I'm pushing for is to totally reimagine Main Street and turn it into senior condominium homes or something like that. Story City has some of those in their area, because I just don't see businesses wanting to come into old Roland on Main Street. But I do see a potential for converting old buildings into housing and taking dead buildings and making them alive instead of just being something that's rotting.
Yeah, that's an interesting, that's a pretty common, and Charlie can jump in here too, that people wanted, that first floor, maintaining the first floor commercial piece. I definitely have seen some weird things that, more so on the new construction side. That's where I kind of lean, like if you're doing an infill, if you've got a missing tooth on your downtown block, or just even the block off. There's a community that I've worked with that has a beautiful square, courthouse square. And we've had the conversation around, well, we probably want to maintain our commercial on those first floors around the square. But if you get a block off, let's maybe think a little bit more creatively, especially if it's an infill type project. So it's a good question that I think more communities are answering, about how do we continue to balance having a little bit of commercial life on that first floor, maybe within the core part of the downtown, but how do you extend that out? So Charlie maybe has some more to share.
yeah, I mean the traditional reason for the commercial, was on first floor was to maintain that retail base. We're seeing more and more communities switch their zoning away from that. Maybe not fully 100% allowing residential on ground floor, but if it's in the rear of the building, if there's a back access to an alley, I would say the commercial ground floor requirement that many cities should typically mostly only apply to really dense, active urban centers, bigger cities. I don't think that requirement really fits the context of maybe more rural downtowns. I think it's okay to have some residential ground floor. I think Pella, Iowa is an example I can think of where they changed their zoning a few years back to allow those residential ground floor uses. Now, for them, they do have a pretty dense downtown, active downtown, so they put that requirement in, that they'll only allow it for the rear of the building where it's the residential unit is accessed from a rear alley, and not the front. And that was mainly a request from a business owner wanting to live in the building that they have their business. And the upper story didn't really work out.
Well, and that's a great example of also thinking about how commercial uses are changing. I can't think of how many communities I've worked in where they have the old Ben Franklin or whatever it might have been, and it's just too big of a space. Commercial uses just don't need that same square footage, so they can't fill up all that space. So that's a great example, Charlie, of like, just take part of that and use it, make it more usable, more rentable. It's a lot more, it's also much better return on investment for the building owner, because they're getting more rent really out of the space.
Yeah, not to keep going on about this, but I think one thing too that's more appealing with the ground floor residential in these old buildings, downtown buildings, is I think it's a little bit more friendly building code wise to do that residential unit on the ground floor than the upper floor, because you don't need the fire escapes and all of that. Well, you still need fire escapes, but you don't need the second floor stair access and all of that. So exterior stair access. So. Yep.
Yeah, there are areas like Nevada that has their historic downtown still has life. And Roland, we have a bar, and that's it. And all the other buildings are abandoned and empty, and they will not rent them out because they do not meet the standards that need to be. So they won't rent them, and they're just sitting there rotting. And yet technically they have to be going for commercial property. And I just watch, waiting to where we have to come and tear down all those old buildings, or is there a way that we can save them and reinvent what downtown looks like?
Yeah, not even not even related necessarily to housing, but community amenities. There's opportunities for those to be community spaces, maker spaces. Obviously, some sort of organization, if not the city, would have to manage that. But places where people can share, like a maker spaces where folks can share industrial equipment for woodworking or whatever, skilled trades, and community spaces as well is another good idea for kind of downtowns. So actually kind of dovetailing off of that, third goal, proactively preserving the existing housing stock. This could also apply to commercial buildings as well, that are sitting there. We just talked about code enforcement, our codes. One thing is residents don't always like to hear this, but code enforcement really is important to preserving the existing housing stock. We understand that not every city has a code enforcement officer or somebody that regularly does this, so there may be a need to share resources among cities. This involves some sort of partnership. Maybe it's the county playing that role where they have a staff member that is able to oversee all the cities. Of course, each city too might have its own regulations regarding maintenance and building condition, but that's something, especially for the smaller communities, where sharing the resources is really essential to continue code enforcement. This is something that's not really an issue for Story County communities, but it's something that needs to continue investing in neighborhood pride. So this means things like quality of life, like our downtowns, strategies to make sure they're lively and there's amenities that people really want to live in. And this also plays into just basic public services. So things like streets in good condition, parks in good condition, investing in those things to make sure people want to actually live in your community, which again, is not really an issue in Story County. We see all these things pretty well maintained throughout, but just not forgetting to continue to invest in those things. One thing we see this a lot well, I shouldn't say a lot, but frequently in many communities is they have existing programs, but they communicate that they're not really being used or not used very often. And a lot of times that's just because people don't know about the programs. So marketing existing programs, and this includes regular communication notices. This could be something at the beginning of the year where a mailing maybe gets sent with utility bills or something along those lines that says, hey, just so you know, or if you're new to the area, here's some programs we have that you can take advantage of to help maintain your home or whatever it may be. This could include some new rehab programs that are targeted at rental units or rather landlords of those units. These people may not live in Story County; they may live somewhere else. So being proactive and letting them know programs available or creating new programs targeted at those. We know these landlords that are not living in Story County maybe don't pay as much attention to their units. So we need to be more proactive in targeting them. Again, not something we see huge prevalence of right now as far as really low quality rental units. There are some, and I think some cities are taking action on bringing those up to speed. And then your energy efficiency and emergency repair programs, again, you have these already, but making sure people know about them and regularly reminding them through these communication notices or other efforts. Fostering grassroots efforts. This is a strategy that, again, is, we don't see, we actually recommend this a lot, and it's not very often we see a county or communities already having this happen, like in Nevada, where there's some local folks undertaking development processes in the past. So this is creating housing advocates. One thing, especially with zoning code changes or zoning code amendments, often the only folks that you hear at the public meetings are those that are against those sorts of things. So we're making sure that when we're bringing these policies forward or bringing these new programs or strategies forward, there's folks there in support of it. So developing these network of housing advocates, that's obviously all of you on the committee and all the people we've talked to in our listening sessions, but making sure they're at those meetings and they're speaking for these things. So we don't just hear from the folks that are against certain policies that would help address the needs in Story County. One thing this has been ongoing for a long time, but the low constrained labor supply in the building trades and construction trades is also a driver of housing costs. There's not only from the labor standpoint, but also just the capacity to build the number of units that are needed. So this is a very long-term strategy, but recruitment, skilled trades residencies, something that could start to spur some help in the skilled trades. So for example, something like a program that if you work here will help pay for schools, loans to pay off your school if they have them, and different types of things like this. So this would be targeted at younger professionals just entering this sort of skilled trades, or those that are interested in it and are currently in school, setting up sort of things like helping assist with apprenticeships and things for the labor industry. So this is really focused at the supply side of the labor supply in the building trades. And we've seen that done in some communities. We used to have and we're seeing a decline in this, where a lot of high school classes, for example, would have a industrial tech class that would build a house throughout the year. They, put up one house a year that each class would, and we're seeing less and less of that happen. And what we're hearing is because of lack of interest from students to do that. So there's a number of reasons for that, but I think some of it is just they're not aware these jobs pay well, and and they can make a really good living doing those sorts of jobs. Going back to the prepackaged site plan, this is actually probably especially important for these grassroots efforts for folks not as experienced in the building environment, but want to proactively do something to help their communities or have a side investment project to go forward with. We saw this in Fairfield as well. Different example, but a group of folks in the community led by I think a couple bankers and economic development folk who they just kind of wanted us. They were interested in it. They had wanted a side gig to just make a little extra money on the side, and so they went in and developed a subdivision and sold off lots. But having these prepackaged site plans would be especially helpful for them to get started. Again, they're just may not be as experienced, but they're very interested in the process. It could also help trigger interest for people that may have been thinking about doing something like that, but not sure where to start. Maintaining fair zoning and regulations. This is something that, again, is something that maybe cities have not thought of before, or they haven't really looked very detailed at their zoning or building regulations. So really, first and foremost is making sure our land use plans illustrate what we want to do. As you all know, making zoning changes are hinge on being in compliance with the comprehensive and land use plan for Iowa communities. So if cities have not updated their land use plans recently, it's doing that first and making sure that you're including the community in that process. So folks are informed, but also educated on where housing development should be focused in the future. One thing that's kind of a easy, low-hanging fruit regarding zoning code is really just broadening residential permitted uses under certain contexts and design standards. So not only I look at a lot of the zoning maps for most of these communities, and this is not uncommon for more rural or smaller communities, but you look at the zoning map and it's mostly yellow, which means single-family zoning district. And you look at the single family zoning district, and that's really what it allows: single family homes, not really much of anything else. So consider broadening those districts and providing context where additional either triplex or townhome or more duplex type uses could be allowed. And maybe those standards are focused at areas near downtowns, along major corridors, along near schools and parks where that additional density is actually more welcomed and would actually benefit more from being near these things and would help downtowns and would help schools and such where families want to be located near. So we'll be providing some high level overview of each zoning code in the plan, just kind of saying, hey, here's what it says now, here's where some changes could potentially be made. One thing that maybe would be take a little bit more discussion and a little bit more a look at with your city councils and planning commissions is evaluating lot sizes and setbacks. A lot of times cities have minimum lot sizes that are just prohibit the ability to build lower cost housing. So if a minimum lot size is 10,000 square feet, you're automatically adding that cost up front for housing development. Whatever it costs for a 10,000 square foot lot, right off the bat, that's the bottom line building up. So this is not saying by reducing those minimums to say 6,000 square feet across the board, that's not saying that you'd require developers to build at that level, but it leaves the option open if they would like to, especially if you're coupling that with the incentives and strategies identified in the previous goals. They may be more willing to build at that lot size. And really just kind of our mantra is focusing on design, not density. and even a 6,000 square foot lot is not that dense, and when you think about it, but if it's single family development, but built as our traditional neighborhoods feels just like others. So setbacks kind of go with lot sizes. Typically, the building code is going to regulate your setbacks anyway, between spacing between buildings for fire safety and such. But making sure your setbacks are aligned with your lot sizes. So we're actually understanding that homes could be built on the smaller lot sizes and our setbacks aren't overly restrictive. One thing we didn't list in here, and I didn't hear a lot about it in our discussions, but just going along with that prepackaged site plans, approval processes and the development process certainty that plays into fair zoning and regulations as well. Oftentimes, what we find is the codes are written in a way that look like it's a fair and straightforward process, but when it gets to the planning commission and zoning or city councils, they're making decisions based on subjective standards and not necessarily objective things. So that's something that it's hard to write. You can't really, you can write it in the zoning code, but the implementation comes from educating council and planning commission members on how they should be making decisions as well.
Yeah, I think this last piece here, this last piece in the first, they very much kind of tie together. So the creating more of an affordable lot supply and the regulations thus tying to that. I think if somebody wanted to put me on the spot and say, what's the biggest kind of thing that I keep issue that we need to be thinking about, and common thing we heard was really about the lot development and lot costs. I mean, we can't, the math doesn't work. The financing community it's not gonna work to build a $200,000, to have a $200,000 home on a $60,000 or $70,000 lot. Lot cost should be 20% of the final sale price of the home. So if your lot is $60,000 to $70,000, your home's going to be $300,000 or more. So we just, that's a key issue that I think we got to think about. And we're not going to have a lot of impact on the cost of land, the cost of the pipe to put in the ground, the cost of the concrete to lay down, but we can think about how we're using that in the most efficient way possible. And really it's a long-term thing for communities too, because it goes back to maintenance on that infrastructure too, and how we're going to pay for that long-term maintenance too. So I think, to me, that strikes me as one of the critical issues. And I would also say there's probably a little bit of an education piece around it, that people have to also begin to understand that, if you want the $200,000 home, you're not going to get that on a half-acre lot. It just, the math doesn't work is kind of what it comes down to. So there's probably a little bit of education that has to be happening out as we're going and presenting this out to the communities too.
Yeah, one thing I want to pull over here and show quickly, and I don't think this is new information to a lot of you. Hopefully I'm not sure if it's showing up here.
It was for a second, then it disappeared, Charlie.
Yeah, my computer's being slow here. There we go. Oh, now I gotta zoom out. Another things you can't control as much. So where things you can control, like lot costs, do play more of a role. So this is the increase in the price index of lumber over the past 2 years, and we've heard this from the developers, and we've heard this from you as well. But you can see the spike right now is really insane as far as how much lumber is cost, and that's just one basic material in housing construction that has gone up. So that's really out of the developer, that's out of city's control. It's just not something you can address really. So where can we make up that cost somewhere else? And lot cost is one thing that is more in city control and you can begin to address. So I did want to pull this up since I do have it up. Like I said, we'll be sending the draft off for you to review this week. We're just kind of getting final formatting items completed, and case studies for our strategies we just talked about. But kind of you get the general idea of where this is headed. One thing where we will have, if I scroll down here a little bit, for each community, we will have kind of a separate spread. So each community can kind of pull out their individual analysis if they want to. It won't be, obviously information from above for the countywide will be relevant as well, but this will focus on affordability for the larger communities, their housing demand model through 2030. As well as kind of building condition and analysis and themes and opportunities. For the smaller communities where our data is just more limited, they'll have a single page spread. Of course, this is freezing up here. That will focus more on just kind of the qualitative analysis of those communities. If I get to an example here. And opportunities and leverage based on our discussions and analysis inventory as well. So that will be available for each community to kind of have their own spread to go through.
I will say too, Charlie, I was kind of making that comment about the lot piece, and just after I kind of wrapped that up, I was thinking that really applies even to our rentals. So, those costs are passed on in the rents. And that's something else that we have to remember too. So.
Yeah, so that, that was kind of, like I said, a high level bullet point of the strategies we're recommending. And with that, we'll identify with each of these, not just the more detailed narrative that we kind of talked about today, but case studies as well as implementation tables with who the partners are that can be involved in each of these strategies, what types of funding tools can be associated with each of these strategies as well. So that will be laid out in detail too. Any questions, comments, concerns, things that we need to add or make sure we talk about from a strategy standpoint that we didn't mention?
I think it looks great. I appreciate your scope. I think that, even for nonprofits like United Way, I mean, I can see ourselves, in some of your strategies as well. So I think that's a powerful piece that by having that scope, I think we all probably could find action items that, that we could take away from your study.
Good. Yeah, I mean, the other thing we always realize on, especially a countywide level study too, is there's going to be something in here that Roland maybe looks at and says, yeah, that makes sense for us. But Nevada says, nah, that doesn't, but this does, and kind of run with it. And hopefully we also find those things where we say, let's do this together because we could do it better together.
Yeah, and I also think that, the strength of you having some specific examples, because I think sometimes we end up in these vague, these kind of broad recommendations, but it's hard to know what that would look like. So I really appreciated that you brought forward the example from Tennessee and the two from Michigan. I took notes on those, and I think those will be great ones to look at more closely.
Yeah, we tend to, we'll sprinkle in a few more. Even we tend to try to put about a case study, almost a page when we get into that section. So
yeah, one thing too, when we talk about these case studies and strategies, I wish my computer would do what I want it to do here, but when I talked earlier about the things that you in Story County and your organizations have control over versus things you don't have control over, we like to kind of lay that out too. And of course, oh, come on, computer. Cutting off here on the one side, but the macro market, these are things that is very hard, well, actually almost impossible for you locally to have control over. Things like what we talked about, raw material costs, interest rates, which actually are benefiting right now you and everyone from a housing perspective. Your available grant resources in the regional market, you may be able to impact some of these things with different strategies. Things like the supply of contractors if we work on the building trades and recruitment, population growth and decline, that kind of goes with, amenities and various things. And job openings, obviously, is state level and locally can have some impact on. But the things that, our strategies, a lot of our strategies focus on is this local market. So zoning, we talked about all these, I'm just kind of putting it in perspective, but zoning regulations, lot supply, we need to add some more things here, but valuations, fees, amenities, all of these things are really, these are things that you can have the most impact on and things that we kind of tend to focus on more. So. I'll just go back up here one more time. Yeah, so when we send the draft off this week, we'll put a timeline on comments and such. I think this will probably be sent to the city stakeholders as well before release to the public for kind of public viewing. But our plan was to present this to the county supervisors in January. So. Let's do a stop share here. Any other comments or questions? Leanne, anything from your end as far as logistics that we need to talk about? Nope, sounds good.
I guess I was answering another call for many members. I was absent for about 3 minutes. I just want to get some feedback on the group here, if you are okay with this being your last meeting, or if you want to see some actual documents. I mean, where you are, what you sense, a sense from you all, how you feel about it.
So Leanne, I have to apologize. I barely can hear you.
So I'll maybe, because I think I know what you were kind of asking there. Maybe it'll be a little bit easier. I think the question there, Leanne, and you can confirm with a head nod, maybe that's easiest. But I think it's, are we comfortable with this being our last meeting, or do you think you want to come back together to meet again after you've had a chance to review the document? Or do we want to kind of leave that question maybe out there, let you review it, and then we could do a kind of a poll or whatever and ask if everybody wants to come back together again to touch base after you've reviewed.
I think it'd be good to come back together after we review the report.
Okay.
That sounds good to me too. This is Hope.
Agree. This is Amelia.
Okay.
Sounds good. So do we want to look, Charlie, I wonder if we want to look for kind of, we're getting into the holiday season here now. And Leanne, I don't know how this kind of fits in your schedule and what the board would like to do, but we can easily meet before probably the Christmas holidays. Or do we want to wait till after? That's kind of.
Yeah, today's the 16th. So, if we deliver the draft this week, that if we gave it a month, potentially we could meet the week of December 14th. You know, if we look at something like well, we could do the 14th or later in that week. Otherwise, yeah, we want to avoid Christmas week probably, although I don't know if many of us will be traveling or anything. So, but other options is very first of the year too, I suppose.
And just kind of my opinion, thinking about construction schedules, things like that, to get this unveiled out there and get interest peaked. It's going to be doing that in January and doing that in February for developers to get interested in this year's build season potentially. So just my opinion, the sooner the better.
When we, yeah, and make sure I'm not muted. When, for some reason my microphone is not picking up very well. It's brand new, so I might just yell at the computer. When we get into the first of the year, we really are going to be limited in time here at the county because of budget work sessions. And I will put this in the chat box too, so you can read what I'm saying. But what I'm trying to say is sooner, like December 14th would be better than waiting.
Okay, that's no problem with us.
Yeah.
14th sounds good to me.
Okay, we'll put it down.
So just traditionally, as Charlie's kind of doing that, we'll get an email out to everybody, but traditionally they're not gonna, that meeting would not be like something where we probably have additional material unless you have some comments that you want to send to us beforehand, but it'll just be an opportunity for discussion of answering any questions that you have. So that's kind of the agenda, just so you kind of know, it's not a super structured agenda. Here's material to present. It's just an opportunity for everybody to come to the table and ask questions and provide some final comments, which is nice. It preps us too for the stakeholder and board of supervisor meetings. All right. Well, I think that's everything for today, isn't it? Charlie, Leanne, did we have any other
Nope.
things we need to cover?
None on mine, no.
Okay.
I will get the recording out there as soon as I have a chance to download it from Zoom so that you can rewatch the meeting and see the presentation again if you have questions. And then if you know someone that's supposed to be in this call and is not, feel free to share it with them as well. They'll get it. They'll get the information too.
Great.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great Thanksgiving.
Thanks, everyone.
You too. Thank you.